Good morning, ladies and gents. Please settle down. And hearty word of welcome to everyone to this second day of Potatoes SA's Congress and the Seed Potato Growers Forum. So glad to see everyone here today. I heard a cell phone. There's a fine of 500 Rand, and it will go right into the pockets of the staff of Potatoes SA. So please, all cell phones, just put it on silent or vibrate or whatever. And then the bathroom facilities, you all know where it is. You were here yesterday. And then smokers. Any smokers? Just raise your hands. Any smokers? Hou op. Stop it. Okay. No, you're welcome. You can go and smoke on the N2. You are welcome to join me there. Did you enjoy last night? You did? Are you here? Oh, fantastic. Did you let the dogs out as well? Not really, yeah. They say no drinking is allowed, no drinking and driving, as I said yesterday. And one of my friends were pulled off near Goodwood, and the traffic officer told him, get out. He said, we suspect that you had a few drinks, so please get out of the car. And then you say the alphabet, but start with the letter M. So he got out of the car and he said, Melphabet. He did. Ek het self afgekeer nou die aand tussen Stilfontein en Potch, toe sê die speedkop vir my, klim uit. Toe sê ek nie ekste gesyp, klim jy in. Dit was nogal lekker gesels. Ja. Hy het my gevra, het ek 'n rekord, toe sê ek ja, verspring onder 13, so dit het nie baie goed afgegaan nie. Ja. Ladies and gents, those of you who know me, I'll have to do this. Please everyone, put your hands in the air like this, and I'm going to take a pic from this side and this angle as well. And I'll just explain to you why I do it. So just put your hands up, please. Thank you. Got it. Everyone, please. That's it. Thanks. Now, why I do this is my kids are very involved with all my gigs or wherever I go to a congress or a conference. And they always ask me, how was the function? I said, look at the applause that people gave me. So thanks. I really appreciate it. Yeah. I thought my drinks were spiked last night. It's the second morning I went for breakfast this morning and I saw a weird character with a red suit. Did you see him there? Who's staying in the hotel opposite here? Did you see that guy? Is he a politician or she? What is it? No, I'm not sure. Do they dress like that to Parliament nowadays or not? Did you see him or not? I'm the only one. My drinks were spiked. For sure, yeah. Yeah, tonight's gala event is going to be a great one. Everyone book their tables with Henry. You're more than welcome to call her or to see her during tea time. So, ladies and gents, our first panel discussion, and our theme is efficiency in production. So let's welcome our facilitator. It's Lindi Botha, and then also Prof Martin Steyn, 37 years research in potatoes. Great to have you here, Prof Martin. And then also Prof Stefanie Midgley, and she is from the Department of Agriculture, Western Cape, and also for nutrition, Alan Bender, and then the grower experience from Dr. Andre Meiring. Let's give them a warm welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2. The aim of today is really to give you as much practical information as possible to take back to your operations to improve efficiencies. And of course, we can't speak about efficiencies if we don't start with production efficiencies and everything that is done on the farm. And today my panel is going to discuss the biome in particular and all the aspects concerning water and climate and soil and everything that can be done there to optimize efficiencies. So we are unfortunately missing one of our panel members. Blas Rios from Mexico, from Cosmocel, would have joined us, but unfortunately had a visa issue. So instead he has sent us a video. So we're going to start with the video and then we're going to kick off with the panel discussion.
Hi, This is Blas Rios from Cosmocel, Mexico. With this small video, I want to discuss about a few issues that we need to think about every time that we design a nutrition program. We need to think about a few things. Normally, we take in consideration what the needs of the crop related with the quantity of elements, minerals, and also we think about the quantity of other things like water. And sometimes we don't think what conditions that crop is gonna face. So normally we say a potato needs 2 or 3 kilograms of nitrogen in this stage. And we consider the soil, what the soil can give it to me, and then we calculate the quantity of fertilizer that we need to apply. And we do that with all elements, but we never consider the growing conditions, humidity, quantity of sunlight, all the environment conditions that the plant is gonna face. Is we need to increase the size of the plant in the same time that we are facing hot conditions. We need to increase the applications of some elements or make the plant support those hot conditions according to what the plant is going to face in that moment.
Thank you. So I think the past 2 weeks have shown us what a reality climate change is becoming, and although we've seen a lot of floods down here in the south, we've had extreme heat up in the north, but we know that in general climate change is going to bring far hotter temperatures. So Alan, I want to find out from you, we're definitely going to see more heat stress on potatoes going forward. So from a nutrition perspective, how can we prevent yield loss as a result of heat and water stress?
Yeah, no, well, we need to first identify, what are the main nutrients for plants. And there's a common misperception that the 3 main nutrients for plants is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But in fact, the 3 main nutrients for plants is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. If you take a plant and you dehydrate it completely in the same way we would take a leaf analysis, and you analyze all the elements, not just the calciums and the magnesiums and the potassiums, etc., but also the hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, you'll see that about 95% of the plant's dry biomass is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And where does this come from? This comes from a process called photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is taking water and carbon dioxide in the presence of sunlight in the chloroplast to convert it into carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So if we want to create biomass in the plant, we need to increase the production of carbohydrates. Obviously, the fresh weight of a potato is also 85% water. So you can see how critically important water is as a main nutrient. So we say the 3 main nutrients for plants is sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. And then we use the elements like calcium and nitrogen to bioengineer the way that we would like the plant to grow. So when we suffer yield losses from stress, really, it's all about stress management. We must understand that the tuber of a potato is a modified stem which works as a storage organ for the potato to be able to store accumulated energy. So it's taking the energy from the sun, converting it into carbohydrates, and storing that energy to be able to utilize when the plant manages stress. When the plant is respirating, that's the process of releasing this stored energy. And the higher the rate of respiration in the plant, the more the plant is actually burning up its own energy reserves. So for us to manage stress is a critical point in preventing yield loss in potatoes, because what we're then preventing is the plant using its stored energy in the tuber to support whatever stress condition it may face. If we then look at nutrition in terms of the elements that we can apply to help support heat and water stress on the plant, the one element for me that I believe is the most important is calcium. So calcium is an element that maintains obviously the integrity of the cell wall and the structure of the cell, but between the cell wall and the cell membrane is an area called the apoplast. And in this apoplast is where this plant stores free calcium. And this free calcium works as a messenger for the plant to be able to react very efficiently to different types of stresses. Also, in this apoplast, the calcium forms like calcium pectates, which you can think of like a special type of elastic glue, that as the cell membrane dehydrates, it maintains contact with the inside of the cell wall so that it doesn't rupture, and it gives the plant the ability to be able to dehydrate and hydrate and withstand the water deficit period that the plants go through, particularly during the midday period.
To illustrate that point, there's a video that we want to show regarding seaweed dehydration. If you could just please play that video before we continue with your comment.
Yeah, so in this video, you'll see that it's a piece of seaweed that's been put underneath a microscope. And what we initially see is that the cells are completely hydrated. There you can see a completely hydrated cell. All those little green spots are the chloroplast inside the cell. And what they do here is they add salinity. They add salt water to the cell, effectively stimulating water stress. And you can see how the cell membrane dehydrates inside the cell. And without good amounts of free calcium in the apoplast, that elasticity is not as it should be, and that cell then ruptures. Once that cell ruptures, we don't get it back. That cell then becomes a leaking cell. So that at night, when the plant rehydrates itself, that cell now is leaking sugary water, plant sap. And that's usually the first source of, or the first point of infection that your fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, and nematodes in the root system. So we must remember that this is applicable to all the cells in the plant. It's in the potato, in the leaf, and in the root system as well. So for us to have a good concentration of calcium in the plant gives the plant a much better ability to withstand this hydric deficit. And then a second element that is not an essential element, but definitely a beneficial element, is silicon. So silica, when we are able to get it into the plant, stimulates the production of osmolytes inside the cell. So these osmolytes are, you can think of like a special sugar that forms around the main organelles of the cell to prevent those organelles from dehydrating, thereby giving the plant better tolerance to heat and drought stress conditions. Also, what happens externally in the plant when you apply silica is it forms structures called trichomes. It increases the production of trichomes. So trichomes is an external structure on the outside of the leaf that changes the microclimate on the leaf surface. And with this, you can think of it like a shade netting. So with a lower concentration of trichomes on the leaf surface, it's like a low percentage shade netting, if you like. The higher the concentration of trichomes, the higher the shade effect is on the leaf, creating a more ideal environment on the leaf surface.
So I know calcium is a particularly tricky nutrient to get uptake in a crop. What are the solutions to improve that calcium uptake and presence of the calcium so that we have stronger plants?
Yeah, well, one of the limiting factors with calcium and the challenges that we face is where we have soils with a low level of calcium in the soil is hungry for calcium. So the soil is a negatively charged colloid that attracts the calcium. The calcium is a positively charged cation that has a magnetic attraction to the soil. So where we have low percentages of soil in the base saturation, when we look at our soil analysis, that magnetic attraction to the calcium is very strong. So only when we have sort of about 65, 70% calcium in the soil is then an excess amounts of calcium, and it's much easier available for the plant. Also, with that type of condition in the soil, usually the structure of the soil is better. So the porosity is better, and the water movement in the soil is better. And this also plays a critical role in helping the plant be more efficient at maintaining water.
So is it just a case of applying the right amounts of calcium, or does the type of calcium applications and the way in which it is applied also matter?
No, the timing of applications of calcium is critical. So we must know that the best time for calcium application is during cell division. So if we're looking at specifically the tuber on the potato, it's from the point of tuber initiation until about 30% of the final size of that potato. So that's when cell division is taking place. So if we want to reinforce that cell with high amounts of calcium, as well as silica by that matter, the correct timing would be during cell division. So normally during the first third of the cycle is when the cell division is taking place, and that is the correct moment to apply as much calcium as you can get into the plant. Once cell division is finished and cell elongation starts, the flow of water also to the tuber reduces, and calcium is moving into the tuber with mass flow. So that's why anything that affects the water uptake of the plant or anything that's affecting the transpiration of the plant is affecting calcium uptake. But the critical time to enforce high production or high quantities of calcium in the cell is during the cell division period.
Martin, I want to ask you regarding the research you've done in the Sandveld, specifically with regards to nutrient management, and then about the weakest links in the chain. We've now heard about the crucial role that calcium plays, but with all your years of research, you must have come across trends or have started noticing that there are perhaps things that farmers are repeatedly doing that can be improved to bring greater efficiencies on the plant, specifically with nutrient applications and uptake.
Yeah, I think, Lindi, to a great extent, farmers know where the weakest links are. I mean, we must always remember, it's like, for those people who attended my talk yesterday, it's like that barrel with a slit in. The most limiting factor is what's going to limit your yield. That's going to limit the productivity of carbon, of dry matter. So every other aspect of your production system can be optimal, but those one or two most limiting factors will in the end limit your productivity or your efficiency. In terms of water and nutrient management, I think we've come a long way since I started working and pestering farmers about especially water management and improvement of water management. But I think I want to focus on two aspects, and the one is irrigation systems and its system efficiency, and the other one is water and nutrient management. You know, the theme of this Congress is 2050 is now, and we're focusing on technology and high-tech solutions, but sometimes it's important to just give one step back and go back to the basics. Things like system efficiency. Over the past maybe 8 to 10 years, we've evaluated many irrigation systems across the different production regions. And sometimes it's shocking to see the performance of some of those systems. Basic things like fixing leakages, looking at the uniformity of water application. Those are simple things that we can do on the farm. Application efficiency, what proportion of the water that enters your system is in the end reaching the soil surface. Those are easy things that can be fixed. I mean, if you drive past a field and you see a sprayer spraying in some direction, it's very easy to pick up. But sometimes uniformity is not so easy to pick up. So just by simply putting out some rain gauges, one can easily pick up if there are problems in your field. Look at satellite images or drone images. You will clearly see the donut rings in your field if there's a problem. So those are simple things we can fix. With regards to water management, I think it was, I don't know, many years ago when Emil, that phrase was coined, om te meet is om te weet. So if you don't measure, you don't know what's going on in the soil. You don't know what the soil water content is, and it's difficult to manage something that you don't know what is going on there. So, and there are many tools available for water management, even if you go to a basic thing like a soil auger. But there are so many tools available nowadays. So I think, like I said, we've come a long way, and many farmers have already accepted some of those tools and using them, and it's very encouraging to see that especially in some production regions, farmers are really adopting these technologies and making good progress in using water and nutrients efficiently. Specifically to the Sunveld, I mean, we did these studies not only in the Sunveld but in a couple of production regions, but I think the Sunveld is this one example that everyone goes back to because of those very sandy soils and the poor water and nutrient holding capacities. And I think good advice from fertilizer companies, from agronomists, have helped farmers to realize that you have to manage the system like a hydroponic system, almost spoon feeding during the growing season. Most of the losses occur because of rainfall, not because of poor water management. We've seen in the Sunveld. So although the winter is the most optimal time for production in terms of making use of rainfall and lower evaporative demand, so your irrigation needs are smaller, the risk of untimely rainfall events and leaching of nutrients is the highest. So if you spread out your nutrients, the risk of leaching is smaller, and it's only for a small portion of your total nutrients. And I think most farmers realize that and are already moving in that direction. And then maybe something that we can talk about also is making sure that if at the end of your growing season you have nutrients left in the soil, there are ways to try and manage that to reduce losses. So we can talk about that as well, yeah.
Are you going to give me some of those examples?
I can. I can, yeah. In terms of nutrient efficiency and nutrient uptake efficiency, we should keep in mind that there's always a chance that some nutrients will remain in the soil. Because the uptake efficiency of crops is not 100%. What do I mean by that? If, for instance, I aim for a yield of, let's say, 80 tons, I need about 300 kilos of N per hectare to achieve that. It does not mean the plant is going to take up all 300 kilograms. But I have to apply that because the plant is inefficient in taking up. The plant only takes up about 60 to 70% of the nitrogen that I apply. So you cannot now say, okay, I'm cutting back 30% because the plant doesn't need that. If you do that, you're also going to cut back on your yield potential. But that means that at the end of the growing season, there's going to be some nutrients left in the soil. And we have to manage those nutrient balances, especially in areas where you have late rain, and we've seen quite a bit of leaching of nutrients at the end of the season in places like Northwest, Western Free State, those places also areas with sandy soils. So nutrients remain in the soil after the crop. If you don't plant a follow-up crop that utilize those nutrients, they're going to leach. And I think especially in the Sunveld, it's often a challenge because of limited water available. Not everyone plants a follow-up crop because we don't have water for that. But I think it's important just to plant something to protect the soil and to take up those nutrients. Otherwise, they are going to leach as soon as with the next rainfall event. So that's very important to keep in mind.
What are the options for those follow-up crops? The type of stuff that doesn't necessarily need more water, but that can still offer some value to the farmer other than just soaking up those extra nutrients?
Yeah, I think often crops like, it depends on where you are, of course. Often fodder crops that can be utilized as grazing. So that's often done, or wheat or crops that you don't necessarily grow to in the end harvest harvest for the seed or for the production thereof, but that can stabilize the soil and that can be grazed. In Northwest, for instance, I know many of those farmers plant a pasture crop. I don't know what's the name in English, borseltjie or some of those crops. But sometimes farmers also plant a follow-up crop that is actually grown, and if rainfall is sufficient to harvest that crop. And in such instances, one should take into account how much nutrients are available in the soil. So you don't necessarily have to fully fertilize that follow-up crop again, because there's still some nutrients in the soil, and that we've also seen. That often it's not taken into account, and the crop is fully fertilized again. So that means you have an extra load of nutrients that still remain after your second crop, and you can almost plant a third crop with much less fertilizers. So that's something that's important to take into account.
Thank you, that's useful. Stephanie, I want to get to the issue of water. We have been inundated with water, but we do know that the climate is going to get drier. I'd like to find out from you what are the specific, what the consequences are of that drier climate. What are the issues that potato farmers could potentially start picking up in the crops, and how should they better manage the water that they do have, just to be able, so that they can see the crop through consistently with the right amount of water through the season?
Yes, good morning, everybody. I think I'd like to just mention, before I directly answer your question, that yes, we do think that the future will be drier in the West Coast, in the sunflower production region, but that is a lot more complex than we first thought. We're starting to understand that certainly in the near term, in the mid-term future, so talking about 20 years from now, before that future really becomes the new climate, the new norm. It's all about variability and the way the rainfall comes, so the rainfall distribution. So we've learned that we can't just take annual rainfall and make a plot and say, oh, we can't really see what's happening. Right, so we're doing a lot more detailed work now, and 2 years ago we commissioned the climatologists at the University of Cape Town to completely revise what we know about the climate trends and the climate futures from climate modeling for the whole Western Cape. We've got 23 agroclimatic zones, and the Sunveld, I think, is covered by 3 or 4 of those zones. So in much more high resolution, what are the trends and what are the futures? We are seeing drying in the Sunveld already. So autumn and winter, we are definitely seeing drying, and we're also seeing longer dry spells. It's the only part of the province where we're already seeing that quite clearly. So less rainfall events and longer spells in between, and in the droughts as well. So that is already happening, and the models for the future tend to also show that. But having said that, as I said, in the next 20 years, what we really have to look out for is the rainfall dynamics and how that changes across the catchments that feed the aquifers that the Sunveld relies on. So rainfall variability, by that we mean not just seasonal, but also monthly, daily, and even sub-daily. So we are seeing, for example, these very heavy, intense rainfall events, even just for a short period in the day, or just for a day, or for, like we saw last week, those kinds of extremes, both on the wet and the dry side. And that is what we have to deal with, I think, in the near term. So
how do we deal with it? Is there any mitigation that farmers can start putting in place?
Yes. So I think for catchment and resource management, first of all, before we get to the farmers, obviously the farmers will then have to manage that resource in every field. But I think we need to look at it as a whole, as a catchment, as a resource that many people are tapping into. And to understand how the rainfall dynamics and that variability, how that changes for example, in the mountainous regions of the east, where we know that most of the rainfall that feeds or recharges the aquifer falls in the mountains in the east, those catchments. And those are protected. They're in pretty good condition, really, to a large extent. And maintaining the protection of those catchments, the way they're managed, but also understanding how the changing dynamics of rainfall in the mountains is going to change runoff, is going to change stream flow, it's going to change recharge of the aquifer that eventually the farmers will then have access to. And then I'm very concerned about what happens in the wet cycles and the wet times. So I think there's a lot more we can do to understand the recharge dynamics when there is water, which streams, how is it feeding the aquifer. There's a very good modeling study that's being done recently, which we're starting to understand that. But I think that variability component is where we come in. We have to start catching excess water, even in field, on every field, wherever possible, through innovative drainage, through the way that we make sure that that water doesn't just run off. Like the water we had, all that rain we had last week in winter, sometimes many farmers just say it just runs off. What can we do? And I've seen examples in the wine industry. Maybe I can mention what farmers in the wine industry are starting to do. So with clever planning of their fields and drainage systems, catching that water in wetlands, even maybe artificial wetlands, or rehabilitated wetlands, catching it in small dams, infrastructure that can be built for that purpose, wherever that is possible, and then making sure that water can be reused and it doesn't run off and it's not lost. So during the wet times, save the water, recharge the aquifer, don't abstract during the wet times when we think, oh, no, there's lots of water, we can use it all, but make sure that the aquifer can recharge. And so we increase those buffers that we have that tide us over longer dry periods and more intense, more frequent, longer droughts that we're expecting in the future from climate change. So it's just a matter of managing that variability better.
So this might not, I don't know if you can answer this question because I think it's quite a political question, but are you a proponent of more dams? Should farmers be erecting more dams to catch that water so that they have it available in a dry season?
I do think that within the laws, what is possible through the regulatory system that we have, working through that system, I think there are opportunities in some areas and a need in some areas for more infrastructure, but not necessarily everywhere. But in areas that are getting dry, that are getting much more variable, there is a case to be made for talking to the Department of Water and Sanitation and to the decision makers to see where extra infrastructure is needed. I'm not a proponent of just building dams willy-nilly, but, and certainly not, I think big dams, we know there's no more opportunities for bigger dams, but certainly managing water so it doesn't flow off as quickly, it can maintain, it can stay in the fields, infiltrate, creating or using wetlands, for example, where there are still wetlands available, or even creating artificial wetlands. Sometimes it can work, but depending on the geology and obviously the sandy soils is difficult. But I think in some cases, built infrastructure can be used cleverly. Well, I mentioned in the wine industry, so some people are now using contours with drainage that then filters, it flows down into an adjacent small, very small dam or a wetland. And that wetland is good for biodiversity, but it's also good for catching that water and reusing it in the vineyard, so that we don't have a situation of bare soil, water running off very quickly, erosion, and it's gone. So I think we must catch more of our water that we have in the wet cycles, in the wet season, to be able to use, and especially also the infiltration, making sure that the soil cover, for example, through practices that Professor Martin also mentioned, conservation agriculture, trying to keep the soil covered more to allow for better infiltration and water holding capacity. But I don't think we really have a really good understanding yet of how conservation agriculture for potato farming or regenerative agriculture, what that does to water demand and water use. Because cover crops also use water, so we need to start building that into our understanding of what is the total use of the field over the whole year, not just for potatoes, but for the system that we're trying to build to keep that water in the soil, but then also that water is being used by the plants that are the cover crop or whatever we're trying to do. So we don't understand that properly yet, and I think a lot more research monitoring needs to be done to see how these dynamics change with whatever practices we put in place.
It sounds to me there's also a lot more collaboration needed between municipalities, water catchment areas, and farmers, governments in general, and researchers, just to understand water usage and the flow of water in future. Andre, I want to get some practical advice from a farmer and from an agricultural economist. If you can tell me from a potato farmer's point of view, you're up in the Free State, so we can move off the Sunveld for a moment and just find out from you, where are the areas where you are seeing the biggest changes happening in terms of climate and how that affects nutrient uptake on your farm? And what are some of the solutions that you found to manage that?
Yeah, I think fortunately, good morning, sorry. Fortunately, I think nutrition and fertilizer is one of the manageable type of factors that the farmer can use. And I think, as we heard yesterday, I think due to the rising costs of not only fertilizer, but all the other inputs, it becomes more and more important to look at your soil, because that's one of the, as we heard, expensive but also a limited type of resource that is available. And I think it's more and more important to look at your soil and use the best soil for potato production. Otherwise, the options are, due to the higher cost, you have to shift to other crops that perhaps use less fertilizer.
So I'd like to speak about the reality of either having to apply less fertilizer or deciding to stop potato production if the fertilizer prices just keep climbing drastically. At what point does a farmer make that decision to take the risk and apply less fertilizer and have a lower yield, to balance the books in that way, or to stop planting potatoes?
Yeah, I think it's the same type of, if there's not risk on a farm, without the risk, I think every farmer will be in a position to produce efficiently. And the theory dictates that if you know all the inputs are fixed and there's no risk, it's quite easy to come on a point and say with a rising price, what is the optimal level of production of fertilization. And but due to the risk in the equation, I think it's quite difficult to decide on that. But I think I come back and say, well, it's the best to use the best your best soil for production, and make the shift and use the other soil for other crops.
What about input management for diseases? We want to avoid those just-in-case applications because it can quickly start escalating and push up the cost of production. But we also don't want to be in a position where we've taken a risk and perhaps a disease catches us at the end of the season, like late blight. How do we weigh up those preventative versus proactive applications?
Yeah, if we look at the late blight as example, I handles it like say insurance. I think there's a type of cost that you have to incur, and very few years perhaps it's necessary, but then it's necessary to do it. And if you look at preventative crop management, I think it's so important to look at your weather forecasts and the development in that field, because I think, as Mary said yesterday, it's so important. Every farm has a unique situation, and during this, as well as the growing stages. And I think climatic conditions, the weather forecast, dictates at what time you have to use preventative type of measurements for chemicals, and and sometimes you have to be reactive, unfortunately, and you have to use it at a later stage.
Alan, I want to speak to you about, I want to get back to fertilizer applications and over and under fertilizing. When we had our discussion to prepare for this panel, Blas mentioned that he was quite surprised at South African farmers, how they have these massive potato plants with a lot of biomass, whereas in Mexico you see the opposite. It's a much smaller plant. And of course, if you've got the higher biomass, requires higher nitrogen. What is your view in terms of how South African farmers are handling those fertilizer applications, and is there room to start reducing nitrogen?
Yeah, I think nitrogen is a nutrient that is perhaps overused a little bit. I mean, obviously it's very important for the bulking of the potatoes and to get the yield, but what it also stimulates is an excessive vegetative growth. And we must remember that the plant is transpirating about 98% of the water that we apply through irrigation or what falls as rainfall. So 98% of the water that we apply is lost through transpiration. 1% of that goes into photosynthesis and the other 1% into biomass accumulation. So if you stimulate a plant with a very high biomass of leaf surface, you're creating a plant with a much higher need for water. And if you're creating that type of plant in a drought condition or a dryland condition, you're setting yourself up for a lot more stress on that plant. And so that plant is then not able to handle that either excessive heat or saline conditions or water stress conditions because it's got so much biomass that it needs to cool down. The main role of transpiration is effectively cooling. It's the cooling system of the plant. And a bigger plant requires more cooling. And when we grow a plant with very long internodes and it's very far from the soil, that water deficit period in the midday part of the day stimulates a lot of stress. And as a result of that, we can have losses in size and also misuniformity of the tubers because now the potato is the storage organ for the leaf. We must always remember that the leaf for the plant is more important than the tuber. For us, obviously, the tuber is more important. But the leaf is where the plant produces its energy. That's where it captures the sunlight to form carbohydrates. And when that leaf is under pressure, it relies on the tuber, which is the reserve organ, to manage that stress. And as a result, we have bad uniformity, poor sizes, and therefore yield loss.
So how do we determine the right nitrogen applications so that we still get your potato growth, but you don't have those massive plants?
Yeah, it's a very balanced method that you've got to have a good balance between your nitrogen to phosphorus, your nitrogen to potassium, particularly to manage your vegetative growth, and your nitrogen to your calcium ratio. So where we have big problems with disease pressure, normally the nitrates are very high in the leaf, and the plant is not able to metabolize this high amount of nitrate, and as a result, the plant is much more susceptible to disease. So it creates a very weak plant. And plants love absorbing nitrogen. It's like children eating sweets. You know, they don't know when to stop. And as a result, the plant is then growing in a direction that we don't want it to grow. So we can manage our nitrogen applications, and also as Prof. Martin was saying earlier, you know, that amount of nitrogen that's staying behind in the soil from the previous crop needs to be taken into account. So perhaps we are applying the right amount of nitrogen at the right stage, but we're not taking into account the residual nitrogen in the soil. Or if we're having any type of soil conditioning products like compost or carbon-based molecules, they are also increasing the efficiency of nitrogen. So that needs to be taken into account because, yes, we know what the demand and the need for the nitrogen is, but if we're not taking into account the environmental conditions, so for instance, nitrogen is much more available in the summer conditions and the hotter conditions than it is in the winter. And the timing of the application, you know, at the beginning when we're setting the potential of the plant and we're building the structure of the plant, it's important to manage the nitrogen on a lower level. It's very easy to top up nitrogen, but it's very difficult to take it away and rebalance your calcium and potassium ratio. And one of the other disadvantages of high nitrogen is you'll end up with very long estolonces. So from the stem, obviously it's attached to the tuber by the estolons, and with high nitrogen applications, you've got a long, thin estolons that now is feeding that tuber. So you can imagine the amount of energy and nutrient that is having to be sucked through that thin estolons versus a much shorter, fatter estolons. It's the same principle as a water pipe. So a thin, small water pipe, it's more difficult to get a volume of water through than a nice, thick, shorter water pipe. And that's effectively the principle that goes behind it.
So, Martin, I want to get back to a comment that you made yesterday for those who weren't in the session where Martin spoke about research that you did on potatoes and how climate change would affect it. So, one of the outcomes you showed was that with the higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we are going to see a lot more biomass in the plants as well, which speaks to the issues that Alan just spoke about. Does that then mean that we can bring down nitrogen applications further without sounding like I'm really harping on about reduced nitrogen, but is there scope for that in future?
Yeah, Lindi, I think once again it's a balance, because you've got bigger plants on the one side, but you must also remember we expect more tubers and bigger tubers to be produced, so the yields are higher, so there's also a higher sink there for nutrients. So I think definitely fertilizer management in general, not only nitrogen, will have to be sort of in sync with what are the yield potentials that you are now aiming for, or that are now possible with a higher yield potential because of elevated carbon dioxide. But also, like I mentioned, there's also that counteracting effect of higher temperatures. So it's not to say in all places you're going to get those increased yield potentials, but yeah, it's definitely a fine balance, and I agree with what Alan has said. One should be careful to over-fertilize not only nitrogen but also often potassium, because I mean the plants can only take up so much. There is definitely such a thing as luxurious uptake, so more than what is needed, and make plants more susceptible to diseases and so on. But yeah, just maybe one thing that I said earlier about the uptake efficiency. In the work that we did, I mean, uptake efficiency of nutrients differ quite a lot for potatoes. For nitrogen, we found 60 to 70% uptake efficiency. Something like phosphorus, the uptake efficiency is between 30 and 40%. So it's not possible to cut down just to the amount that the plant takes up, because you need an excess, otherwise the plants will not take up sufficiently. Potassium on the other side, plants take up as much as there is. So if you apply more, it will take up more, and we found in several cases that more than 100% of what was applied was taken up. So it means it mined from the soil as well. So one should keep that in mind. There are also differences between nutrients, and that should be taken into account when you do your planning for your fertilizer program.
Andre, I want to speak further about inputs that are being taken off the market. We've seen a lot of chemicals that are coming under review, active ingredients that are no longer available. How are you as a farmer approaching that reality and that future where those critical inputs that you used to rely on are perhaps no longer going to be available? Are you finding that there are sufficient solutions in the market, or specific products that you've seen have made a difference and can really come in and replace those ones that are being removed?
Yes, I think that's twofold, the answer. In the short term, I think there is no other option to use to look at the various alternatives that's available. Not always with the same effect, but I think there's a chemical agent can play a big role there, and we have to look at that. There's no alternative on the short term, and I think on the longer term, it's so important for the research, as we heard, I think yesterday, I think Chris mentioned it as well. It's so important to look in the longer term for research for type of green products, biological products, and other products that we can use. So I think it's a two-step type of solution that you have to, there's no other option to use. That's what's available in the short term, and then it's so important that we, in the industry, to look at the alternatives that may be available in the future.
Thank you. I see I'm quickly running out of time, so I want to give the audience a chance for some questions, and then I'm going to give each of the panelists just a minute or two just to summarize some key take-home messages that you'd like the audience, that one thing you want them to remember after today. Are there any questions from the audience? Can I take it that I answered all your questions? Or did I just leave you with so many extra questions? There's a question over there.
Good morning to the panel and everybody present. We use dolomitic water and applying calciums. In what form would you suggest that? Would the application of gypsum be suitable, and calcium, and can the dolomitic water affect the uptake of something like gypsum, for instance?
Dolomitic water, so water that obviously contains a lot of calcium and magnesium, combined with gypsum application. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're applying a gypsum application, the main purpose of that application is to replace or build the calcium in the soil. So the gypsum is a calcium source that once dissolves becomes calcium on its own and sulfide on its own. And that calcium in ionic form is designed to react with the soil, so building the soil structure. And a high amount of gypsum application requires a lot of water to be able to react in the soil. So they say on average you require about 1 liter of water to activate and dissolve about 2 grams of gypsum. So one must always remember that when you're applying a high amount of gypsum to the soil, you need a lot of water to activate it and prevent the salinity that comes with it. Because the problem is if you apply a high amount of gypsum without sufficient rainfall or irrigation, what you'll end up doing is creating a lot of salinity before the soil is able to absorb that calcium and buffer back to its original state. When using water that has got dolomitic lime in it, what you're doing is you're applying calcium and magnesium at the same time. So it's good water, because what that means is you can save on your calcium and your magnesium applications. But yeah, obviously the reason you'd be applying the gypsum in the soil would most cases be to try and displace sodium in the soil or to try and build the soil structure. And that would work hand in hand with the water that has got magnesium and calcium in it.
So if you're faced with a situation where water is an issue, is there an alternative to the gypsum application?
In terms of changing the soil structure, there are products on the market now that are sort of micronized gypsums and liquid limes that are a lot more effective because they've got a much smaller particle size and create less salinity. So you can also then put it through the irrigation as opposed to broadcasting it over the whole land and focusing the attention where the water is perhaps being irrigated. So with that manner, you can still treat the soil and correct the calcium around the root zone without creating too much salinity.
Okay, thank you. Does that answer your question? Okay. Are there any further questions? Right in front here, please.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Emil Jordan from Metos. Andre, this is a question for you or to you. You mentioned, I heard you mention you using weather forecasts, or if you are able to use weather forecasts, you can better decide which chemicals to use. What would prevent you, if you have a very accurate weather forecast, what would prevent you from using that weather forecast and to coincide that with disease models? What's your practical experience? Why would you or wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, thanks. I think the balance is between the cost of preventative chemicals and the probability to occur some loss. And I think it's so important, not only the weather forecast actually, but from my point of view, in the Eastern Free State, if we look at late blight, it's a disease that has a direction that's spreading. So I think it's not only the cost, but weather forecast puts you in a position to make timely decisions when to start using preventative type of chemicals. And I think so it's accurate weather forecast and combined with other soft information from the area or adjacent areas. And I think automatically your situation on the farm, the growing stages of the various potato fields. It's interesting, we visited a week ago Rwanda for other purposes, and that small blocks of potatoes there, during the few days, I did not see anyone spraying potatoes, and I can't find any diseases or something on the leaves that was looks like a problem, or look like the problem. But the difference is, it seems that they harvest the potatoes on the early stage, so there is no fields that is going down. So they and you don't see any problems there. So I think the growing stage, your situation on the farm, and especially the actual weather, not only the forecast and the cost. I think that combination is important for deciding the way to go.
Are you finding that those weather forecasts are still accurate enough that you can base your decisions on?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think there's so many various tools that you can use, but I think nowadays it becomes more and more reliable. Especially if you look in, my perception is if you look at the wind speed as actually for other purposes, it's quite accurate. So I think there's some information that you can use from with the various applications, and you have to decide which one for which type of part of the weather.
Okay. Stephanie, just to add to that, is there, we've been speaking a lot now about rain variability. In your climate change studies, is there another aspect of weather that you think is going to be particularly problematic to potato farmers, that is going to be really difficult to manage going forward?
Yes, I think one of them has been mentioned, and that is excessive heat stress and heat waves. I don't think there's terribly much you can do about that in the potato industry. But there are other factors that we know very little about. We don't have the data, we don't have the scientific analysis. But when they happen, they have huge impacts on agriculture. And we see that, for example, with storm winds, hail, even things like humidity or sunshine. We don't have the data. We don't know how these things are changing. And they are massively important for plant growth and potential damages in terms of some of those factors. So it's not so much the averages. We know it's warming gradually, but that's not a bad thing. And we know potatoes actually respond well to that. They respond well to gradual carbon dioxide, but it's those extremes that are so difficult to manage. And they're often very localized, they're often very intensive and very quick, and the damages are done in a few days. And that's something we need to grapple with. But we need a lot more monitoring and data and analysis on those factors.
Is there anything farmers can do in the meantime, or in terms of their planning for the future, having those uncertainties in mind, or is it a wait-and-see situation?
I think what we're starting to realize in agriculture, and all the other commodity groups as well are talking about this, is that it's really, we're not going to wait till we have all the answers, neither on the climate change side nor on the practices side. We have to just start doing what we know, what the researchers are, just start. Learn by doing, learn from one another, and not just learn from one another in terms of what the neighbor is doing. That's brilliant, that works very well, but also what other industries are doing. So there's all of our industries, the fruit industry, wine, they're all talking about it, they're all trying things. And I think if we stand together more as a sector, not just individual farmers or farmer groups or even the commodity group potatoes, but working with the other commodity groups as a sector to develop practices. First of all, what happens, what are the options in practices, but also in terms of one voice for the sector when we are, for example, fighting for water. We're starting to get into the situation where I know managers in my department who are starting to have to fight for water because there's already rumblings about water being possibly reduced allocations for agriculture because there's such great needs for other users. So we really need to have one voice. It's not going to help to have infighting, everybody doing their own thing. And the sector will only be taken seriously and have power to negotiate and to fight for water if it stands unified. So we are really proposing that individual farmers, but also the representative groupings, work closely together and come up with a vision and come up with enough evidence, data, research, science-based evidence and data that shows how important or how much water is needed for potato farming, how much will be needed in future, and to safeguard that amount of water that is going to be needed in future for food security for the sector. So those arguments, how much, what is the economic, the social benefit of the water that is used for potato production relative to other possible uses, other economic uses, other social uses. So those arguments aren't being made strongly by the sector, and they have to be made as a group, not by potatoes alone or by wine alone. Everybody's trying to do it by themselves at the moment, but certainly within wine and fruit and table grapes, in the last year or so, people are really coming together to start talking to each other and plan these things much more strategically for shared risks like water that affect everybody, and working with us as well in government.
Yeah, I think a potato is a staple food. It's got such a strong case to be made to get the water allocation that is required. But if we're not vocal about it, then nobody's really going to hear our voices. And because human settlements get first preference with water and population growth, there is a real danger that we are going to sit.
I think the consequences of not having enough water through poor governance or decision making around the resource is dire. And I don't think the decision makers or other water users or people thinking about how water should best be used always know these things. And I don't think the sector is, as you say, not vocal enough. But it's not just being vocal, it's actually having a vision, a strategy, and the data to back it up. That really gets the decision makers to listen and make the right decisions.
Martin, you want to add something?
Yeah, can I? I completely agree there. I think we're not probably vocal enough. I mean, we know that potato is very dependent on water, but it's one of the most efficient users of water. I think if Gavin is here, Gavin Hill once told the story of a farmer who applied for a ploughing license in KZN, and the condition was as long as you don't plant potatoes because it wastes water to produce potatoes. And I think those are the perceptions that we should get away from. It's a short season crop, highly productive in 90 days compared to many other crops, and that makes a big difference in its water use efficiency in the end. So that's we should print it on our potato pockets and put it out in the news so that people know about that, decision makers know about that. And we get rid of those perceptions.
The research I've been doing shows that potatoes have got the lowest water footprint amongst all the staples in the world: rice, wheat, maize, everything. So, and it's not just a small difference; it's really a massive difference. So there's a huge case to be made for greater potato production, but sustainable potato production. And I think that's a winning argument that we can take to government to make sure that the potato industry gets its fair share of water. Are there any further questions before we wrap up? Over here.
Just from experience, I've been working in the Sunveld for most of my years, just a bit shorter than Martin have mentioned. I think there's two things which is very important, these cover crops. Stephanie was talking about wind spells. We've seen that a lot of times. A whole field blown away or part of it, and if you would have had a cover crop, it would have happened. So that's a very important one. And I think we've been talking about solutions, something like precision farming. Sampling your soils, grid sampling, managing your soils from the start on. Not after you've planted, but pre-plant, already managing what's happening in your soil. Making sure that your soil is deep enough to have enough roots. If you don't have roots deep enough, you can't use the water that's in the soil on a greater depth. So there's a lot of things that we already can do before we plant, which can help us with a better production. So let's start with what's already available, technology that's already available, and look at that, not after you've planted. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a good comment, and I think that's relevant for a lot of the things that we've discussed today, is just to make sure that we use the available resources and use the available information that is out there, and then just also channel it into the right direction, be it to government to ensure we still have the water, be it onto farm management practices to make sure that we use what we have sustainably. Andre, I'm going to start on your end. If there's one thing you'd like farmers to walk away with today, one item of information to use in their operations, what would it be?
Sorry, I can't hear well.
So I'd like to hear from you. What is your take-home message for the audience? If there's one aspect you want them to remember and to consider applying on their farm to improve their efficiencies, what would it be?
You. I think in total we have some manageable factors on the farm, and as mentioned there, a lot of information from research, and I think and unfortunately on the other side we have a lot of factors that we have to be reactive on, that which out of our control. And in total, I think overall you have to be a type of look at the risk management strategy to globally, or in total for the farm, to look at that factors and use that to be in a position to produce efficiently. Okay. I think so. I think the risk management in total, given all the research, all the information that you have, to use that in total.
Thank you. Alan, your take-home message?
Yeah, I would say we just need to better understand what the limiting factors are before planting a crop. You know, identify, are there challenges in the soil with salinity? Are you going to be planting at a time of year where, you know, heat waves and excessive heat stress is a problem? What is the quality of the water like? What is the structure of the soil like? And with all those bits of information, place them together to be able to identify, you know, what are the main limiting factors and how can we prime the plant to better adapt to these conditions. You know, we don't need to wait until the heat wave comes to then react. We can already start priming that plant with, as mentioned, you know, products like calcium and silica. You could even use lots of different types of biostimulants to help support the plant when the plant is under stress conditions. And I think the biggest thing we need to be able to manage is the stress. So if we manage stress in plants, we manage the biomass accumulation in a favor that we want to basically accumulate more biomass in the region of the plant that we want to harvest. And there's lots of tools on the market to do it. I mean, there's biostimulants that can increase the production of aquaporins in the root system, you know, that increase the efficiency of water uptake. And you know, by understanding if water is, for instance, a limiting factor, we understand that we need to reduce our nitrogen applications and not grow big vegetative plants that are more thirsty. And yeah, I think with that in mind, there's a bright future, particularly with all the new products coming onto the market. There's a lot of new biostimulants and soil activators and bioactivators that can be used in conjunction with the chemical fertilizers to increase their efficiency. And I think that's what we need to be looking at, is how we can increase the efficiency of what we're doing and how we can prime the plant to better tolerate whatever the limiting factor is.
Okay. Yeah, I think the biological space is a very exciting one, and I know there's a panel coming up on that later on. Stephanie, take home message.
I'll be quick. I'd like to say measure, 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 whatever you can. What we can measure, we can manage. And if we want to drive efficiencies, that has to be data-based. The sensor technology development that's happening at the moment is mind-blowing. Weather station technology understand what's going on underground, understand what's going on in your weather, integrate those things into your own on-farm data system, but then also as a region, and use that for decision making. That will drive up efficiencies, but we don't have good enough understanding of what's happening in the environment, and then what the plant needs are specifically for precision irrigation and so on. So, yeah, I'm a proponent of we have technologies available that are amazing now. Many farmers are using them, but I think it can be rolled out much more.
Thank you. Martin?
Yes, I think we all realize there are going to be many challenges in future, but I think potato has a bright future in spite of all those challenges. And I just want to end by saying I think our farmers are one of a group of farmers that are among the best in the world, our potato farmers. So that doesn't mean we don't have work to do still, but from traveling around the world, look at other places where potatoes are grown. I think our farmers are doing very well under the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. That certainly gives us a lot of food for thought. Thank you for the panel. You've definitely stimulated a lot of extra questions in my mind, which I'll certainly follow up with you later. And I hope that everybody has received something that they can take home to improve efficiencies. Thank you.